All right, cool. Next episode of Crypto Nuggets. I'm here with Blane Sims from Truebit. Blane, how we doing?
Doing great, Joe. How are you today?
I am all right. So I'm very excited for this podcast. I've been following Truebit for a while, but before we get into it, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your journey been? How'd you find yourself getting into Truebit?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I am a infrastructure product guy. I've been doing product management myself for about 25 years. Got started my early days in development labs at some big old school companies, like one's part of HP. It was at IBM for a while. My career from there really took a turn towards e-commerce, online marketing, really high scale systems. How do you provide the infrastructure support, all of those critical things that we know today as Web 2. I had an opportunity to meet Jason Teutsch, founder of Truebit, a few years back. I'm really intrigued by the project and just had an opportunity to jump in full time a little over a year ago now. And it's been a really busy year, almost 18 months at this point since then.
Very cool. So for anyone who's never heard of Truebit, period, what's kind of your elevator pitch? How would you quickly explain it to someone?
Yeah, so Truebit is a verified computing platform. We like to think of it as making it possible to trust code that's running on computers that you don't control. We solve for what I call the hand wavy parts of Web3 architecture. These are the things when you talk to someone who's built a Web3 app, they love to talk about what chain or blockchains they're using, how amazing all that is. And then there's all the rest of the stuff that they have to do to make the app work that they wave their hands over. And the reason they're waving their hands over is that none of that stuff actually runs on chain. These are all black box kind of functions, backends that are typically running on centralized cloud services. And the hand waving comes in because there's a discomfort with the fact that the transparency that you're seeking, recording transactions to a blockchain and having an overall decentralized approach to your app is really compromised by what we like to think of are these shadows of where code is running. You can't actually see what's happening. So that's point one. Point two, obviously, if you're running your code on a centralized web service, you're not really taking advantage of all of the resiliency and actually the enhanced security that comes from running on a decentralized network. So what we're here to do is to provide a way to safely run really any type of code that doesn't fit into blockchains, into smart contracts on a decentralized network, get rid of that hand waving, at least in the places where it matters the most, and bring transparency to Web3 apps that developers are kind of hungry for. Practically speaking, this means we can provide you with immutable proof as a Web3 app developer, proof of how you obtained data that came off chain, and proof of what's actually happening, that that code that you wrote that runs off chain is executing properly and you didn't modify or change the results.
Gotcha. So, I think a lot of people, when they just hear bringing something off chain, on chain, they maybe think of an oracle. And an oracle is typically really around data coming off chain, on chain. So this is kind of like code execution. Anything you're doing off chain, making sure it's run properly as you intended, it's not tampered with, and then bringing the results back on chain. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the Oracle comparison is fair. I think the thing to remember, right? So what do we do in ledgers? What do we do in blockchains? We're recording data. We're recording that something happened. Whether it's the movement of assets from one wallet to another, or this public attestation of some piece of data. So all of these off-chain functions, and certainly when you're needing to, as in an Oracle, needing to pull data in from an off-chain source, maybe it's a Web2 API, maybe it's off-chain storage, maybe it's an AI model that you've created yourself or you're relying on from someone else. What you're pulling in is data. So having essentially a transcript of how you got that data, where it came from, was anything modified, and proving that nothing was modified from the source of the data to any changes or transformations or computes or modeling that you do along the way. That's where Truebit comes in.
Got it. So it's almost like an audit trail. It's a way of doing diligence on the code that was run off chain. Again, is that a way to think about it?
That's right. And it's an audit trail, but it's also an execution environment. We're not just providing you an audit, we're actually executing that code for you. So you have a place to deploy and host these off-chain functions. We deploy them as serverless functions. So if you've ever written a serverless function, it's very easy to write a code for Truebit. You get a place to host that code, have it executed on a decentralized network, and you get that audit trail at the end.
Gotcha. So correct me if I'm wrong, but Truebit's been around for 6 or 7 years. So what have y'all been up to that whole time? I know you just joined, but kind of what's the arc there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. So Truebit started as a research project. Our founder, Jason Teutsch, did research in game theory that actually was referenced by early on by a number of different projects in the Ethereum community, really looking at verification as a mechanism for scaling Ethereum. We saw that kind of play forward on the Truebit side through a groundbreaking white paper that we published that was co-authored with Christian Reitweisner at the Ethereum Foundation. That was around 2017. This paper really was one of the kind of, again, foundational ideas that drove things like layer twos and all sorts of different thoughts around scaling Ethereum. Meanwhile, Truebit itself was focusing on, okay, great, that's scaling Ethereum is one thing, but we're really, really thinking about how do we make off-chain compute as safe and as kind of generalizable as possible. So in 2021, we launched Truebit on Ethereum, which is our first product. Really saw that in the context of Ethereum as an enhancement, as a way to enable smart contracts to perform more complex tasks. But really, Truebit on Ethereum works completely within that environment. We used the time for the past couple of years to learn a lot more about how developers are actually using Ethereum, using other blockchains, and where their challenges actually lie. And starting 18 months ago or so, started building our next generation product, which we announced late last year.
Right. So that was Truebit Verify. And so was that kind of the culmination of all the work that had been done? Was that any kind of a pivot, or is that a net new product? Just tell me more about that.
I would say, yeah, I think you nailed it. It's a culmination of the work that's been done. So again, the problems that we heard when we were particularly deeply engaging with folks after the launch of Truebit on Ethereum, is that the developers are facing issues that are much bigger than Ethereum, or really any blockchain in particular for that matter. So the key questions we were being asked is, how can you make the code that doesn't run on blockchains as trustworthy as if it had run on a blockchain? And how can you provide proof of correctness or proof of authenticity for all the data that's included in a blockchain transaction that, again, most of it's not coming from within that transaction itself. So that might be data you're getting from Web2 API, an AI model, et cetera, like we were saying before. The final challenge we saw was, how can you make it easy to develop for Web3? Can you make it as easy as, for example, writing and deploying an AWS Lambda function? Heard that multiple times, that this is, it's got to be a lot simpler, for example, than developing a smart contract, which is a fairly fraught and rarefied skill set. Taking on all that feedback and really built Truebit Verify from the ground up. It is you see it as a next generation platform without a dependency on Ethereum, a dependency on any blockchain in particular. So cross-chain, kind of natively based, but really more importantly, positioned to provide verification for any use case that you can throw at it.
Awesome. So I mentioned how you guys have been around for a while, 6-7 years, you've been building. A lot of the best products, the best technical products out there might still fail because they don't have marketing or distribution. So how are you ramping that up? How are you thinking about getting the word out more to developers?
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely started out as a smaller team. We're growing quickly. I actually think one of the great things about Truebit is the strength of our community. It's still relatively small, but not small from the standpoint of typical startup, right? Tens of thousands of folks in the Truebit community. There are so many people who believed in the project from the very beginning, and we are excited to be laying out the roadmap for what's coming next. For us, I think particularly this year, you'll see a lot more visibility. We are investing in marketing, investing in kind of presence and awareness. Just looking forward to the kind of acceleration that we're going to see as we grow the community that's already been with us from, in some cases, from the start.
Very cool. As you think about how to connect with developers and get them to use Truebit, is this an educational process? Do they know they need this yet, or are they still happy with Web2 solutions or happy with centralized solutions for compute? What's that messaging like? What's those conversations like as you talk to developers building a Web3?
There's really, let's say, kind of two challenges as Truebit engages the developer community in particular. First challenge is the Web3 developer community itself is still small and it's growing. So we absolutely want to be a part of this revolution in the way we think about how compute works. And so part of it is just getting along with the other folks that are cheerleaders for Web3 development in particular, getting in front of folks that have challenges that transparency and decentralization are likely to help them solve. So that's kind of think about that as kind of growing the pie, if you will, who's working on Web3 projects. But then once you enter into the folks that are already well on their way, I think awareness of our solution is probably the biggest challenge. Once again, there's this tension that we see when we talk to Web3 developers around lack of transparency in large parts of their architectures, Certainly, they talk about it in terms of, are they sufficiently decentralized in their, in their designs? In some cases, we provide what I'd call like a get out of jail free card for that transparency and decentralization question. We fill in the gap between what you can transparently do in a smart contract and what you can otherwise force to do in black box kind of backends.
We've been talking about developers a lot here. They're going to be using Truebit. They're going to be needing compute. Is this kind of like a marketplace here? I mean, there's demand for compute, and then where's the compute come from? How do you think about this two-sided marketplace?
Yeah, like anyone who's building a compute network, you do have this marketplace dynamic that ends up coming into being, right? So the demand certainly comes from Web3 developers and the Web3 projects. I would see, folks building blockchain-based applications are, in terms of our focus, our number one priority, because the better we do at making it easy and safe and transparent for these critical application components that they need, these particularly the integration components, pulling in Web2 code, things like that, the faster they get to move, the more we see joining the kind of the Truebit community. That said, to your point, there's a supply side of this as well, right? So we see, just as important in many ways, supporting a group of node providers, providing them the capabilities they need to run if it's an individual, right? Essentially like a small business of providing nodes, or certainly for larger, kind of more established infrastructure providers, providing them the ROI on pointing their assets towards the Truebit network. So it's definitely a balance, but in the chicken and egg problem, we definitely look at the beginning of this is providing the right platform for the developers.
Mm-hmm. If you kind of had to describe your persona, I guess, for a developer, or your persona for a node provider, who are you thinking about? Who are you targeting first?
For developers, we are looking at folks that are actively building projects that have a dependency on one way or another on a blockchain. That's the Web3 community. That's the community that's already raised its hand and said transparency and proof are necessary ingredients for what they're doing. We do see opportunity beyond that as more of the Web2 world and the corporate world start to think out of necessity embrace decentralized compute, but we think that journey is a little bit longer. In terms of the types of projects we support, I mean, we're open. We have active use cases in pretty much every category that you can think of that people are talking about in Web3. We've got good interest and increasingly kind of good traction going in those areas.
Sweet. So you're talking about making it easy for developers, and there's this this framework, this concept called WebAssembly, or WASM. Maybe just give a brief overview of what that is, and then how it plays a role for Truebit.
Absolutely. So WebAssembly, if you're not aware of it or not following it closely, I definitely would say is something that should be on everyone's radar, regardless of whether they're in the Web3 world or in the more traditional kind of world of compute right now. I don't think it is an exaggeration to look at WebAssembly as being the future of all distributed compute. So what is WebAssembly? So WebAssembly is interesting. It was actually developed initially as a way to run code in an agnostic way inside of a web browser. So you see the very earliest instances of WebAssembly being built into Firefox and Chrome and Safari as ways for things like really sophisticated games to program code that you can run natively in a web browser. And you say, well, what on earth does that have anything to do with decentralized compute and certainly Web3? Well, as it turns out, if you can make code portable enough, safe enough to run on any device, even the smallest, set of computing capability that you can imagine on a cheap smartphone, then you've built essentially a building block that can be used anywhere. And so WebAssembly today is increasingly used to power things like edge compute. Joe, you were mentioning that you spent some time in your early career at a company called Fastly, which is a huge, edge computing provider. Fastly uses WebAssembly to power all of the kind of advanced functions that you can deploy within their infrastructure. You see WebAssembly also showing up in some layer one blockchains as an alternative to the EVM as their virtual machine of choice for running code. We use WebAssembly at Truebit as a very, very safe and transparent sandbox for executing code. So what we're able to do with WebAssembly is say you can write code in any language. Right now we see most of the code on Truebit coming in C++ and Rust and JavaScript. write code in any language, but execute on any machine, but execute in a safe way. WebAssembly doesn't open up the same security holes as things like a Java virtual machine or the V8 virtual machine that runs Node.js code, for example. And then importantly, from our perspective, WebAssembly is observable. We can, in our low-level verification as a concept starts with being able to say, can you prove to me that something happened? So we're able to look inside of WebAssembly and actually from a machine code level, step by step, go through a program and prove one way or another whether something executed or not. WebAssembly gives us a really capable and portable way to do that.
Very cool. So you brought up use cases. Let's dive a little deeper. So are there any real life use cases you can talk about, really tangibly, how it came about, the need, how it's working? Beyond that, any future use cases you're really confident that are going to start occurring more and more that just maybe haven't yet?
Yeah, absolutely. Marquee use case and what will likely be the first project that's built on top of Truebit to itself launch live comes from the supply chain space. So the problem we're solving, we work with a really interesting supply chain blockchain called Quadrants. They're deeply involved in supply chain authenticity use cases within the EU. Think of things like luxury goods and products that have a registered origin, proving that those are authentic. They're using Truebit Verify to help them safely integrate and move data between two blockchains. So they have a series of blockchains that the different players within consortium that they're helping power have used to say, hey, this fabric comes from this origin, or this other component comes from a different origin, and they need to integrate those separate blockchains. In some cases, they're private blockchains even, integrate those into a common public blockchain. So Truebit is providing the platform for them to execute the code that reads the data, validates the data from its origin blockchain, and writes the data into kind of the destination blockchain. So that interoperability and kind of bridging function, if you will, is kind of the first big use case we see. We've got active development projects going on in the carbon credit space where the need is actually to safely bring data in from an AI model. So there's a project that's verifying the existence of forests. So when people issue carbon credits against the fact that a forest is being preserved and capturing carbon through the trees, this project is using satellite data to verify that the forest is actually still there. Obviously, that's something that is not necessarily scalable for a human to do. So they have an AI model that does that, but they need to make sure that the AI model isn't falsifying the output. And so they're running key components of that model through Truebit to have an auditable result. And then really interesting kind of projects popping up through the early access program over the past 6 weeks or so since we've opened it up. Just talked with a really interesting project in a regulated industry in the pharma space that has a need to basically publicly document, the documents are changing, but those documents themselves need to be made private. So Truebit's going to help them kind of bridge the private storage and public kind of records of their documents.
That is really cool. I mean, it's such an obvious need when you think about it, when you're going to be relying more on AI or more on something to be true for an event to occur, whether it's an insurance claim or, like you were saying, the carbon credits. That's really cool. So back to your comment about the bridging. So, there's obviously bridges today for blockchains to go, move assets between. So is this like a verifiable bridge is another way to think about it, kind of piggybacking earlier?
It's a strategy. I think, bridging itself is a huge area of research. And I think there are a lot of different viewpoints on the right way to do it. What we provide, so I certainly couldn't say that we have a panacea for all use cases, but what we do provide, particularly in the case of data portability, is a mechanism for one party to initiate the movement of data, movement of assets even, from one chain to another, and to do it in an auditable and provably correct way. So for applications where that model works, or there's one party that's kind of helping push things forward, we provide a way to do that where there's now not a shadow of suspicion on the initiating party that they lost something along the way and oops, it's gone, or oops, they stole it. That use case is really, really promising, for sure.
Yeah, it's almost like the need is going to get driven or forced by customers of customers. So maybe I'll go back to the insurance example. I'm not going to insure something unless you can prove to me that something wasn't tampered with or a model wasn't tampered with. And that's maybe going to drive some of the demand here rather than a company just saying, oh, we should do this just because we should. maybe they're going to get certain demands on them. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. To me, this need for proof definitely has the question of who are you trying to prove it to, right? And I think I actually think it's difficult for those of us that are used to traditional ways of computer, traditional modes of business operation, to think of all of the the ways that you actually can't predict who needs proof, right? You think, okay, I'm only dealing in your insurance use case, I might only be dealing with whoever wrote the policy and whoever paid for the policy, but there are stakeholders that exist beyond that that aren't necessarily all enumerable, and the question is, can we create durable evidence, durable proof for all of these critical business functions that are going on that make things that are ripe with fraud or unfairness, make them transparent.
It just seems like I might have mentioned this in the podcast episode that hasn't been released yet with Space and Time. Space and Time is basically a database or a data warehouse where they're trying to verify everything that occurs within the database itself. So it's got a proof of SQL kind of function. It's got a tamper proof aspect to it, and it just seems like the future is verify everything on the blockchain in a database that got executed off chain. It's just all got to be provable for either just it's a better way to do things, or with AI and things that could be fake, fraud, whatever. What do we trust? What are we going to trust? 2-3 years from now, 5 years from now, everything is just going to have to be verified. What do you think of that? You think that's the future we're looking at?
Agree wholeheartedly. I think AI, you have to be living under a rock for the last year if you haven't been following, AI, large language model kind of explosion. The questions of where did the data come from to power that model? Where did, as you would get, any particular response from a model, like how did you come up with that, right? Because it could be critically important, right? If the models ultimately are driving decision making, practically speaking, you may have regulatory requirements. I know it's hard for us to think about, but in Europe, for example, automated decision making comes with requirements that you disclose it, and you're able to show how you got to a decision, and people can modify or remove data they don't that belongs to them that doesn't belong as part of that decision. You have to be able to show all of that. So verification at multiple layers, I agree with you, is moving from this where we started, this kind of research concept, into really being critical for day-to-day operation of a lot of systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jason kind of came up with this idea for Truebit years ago, really been honing the solution, the problem. At this point, if someone has this problem to solve and they don't choose Truebit, how do you think they're going to solve it? Do you have any competition here, or how are people going to take care of this if not with Truebit?
Yeah. The biggest competition we face is just saying it's a problem for tomorrow. So sweeping things under the rug by putting them in in a back end, a black box running on AWS. I don't think that that's competition for too long, to be honest with you. Again, because of the tension that exists within the applications that are doing that are seeking transparency, but then having to settle short. So I think what's going to happen over the next year or two is really, to your point, this explosion of different layers of verification, different ways to verify, and really a kind of critical thinking about stopgaps that may have come before that aren't really the right solution anymore. So I don't know where we're at a point right now where we're saying, hey, it's Truebit versus X, Y, or Z. I think that day may come where we see, I've found another project that might be do something similar to Truebit, and I'm trying to weigh the pros and cons. Right now, it's more just open fields, a bit of a land race, just to get the problem solved, and then we'll see how things go from there.
Gotcha. So it's a new year, 2024. What do you all got in store? What's on the roadmap? What do you got planned?
It's a huge year for us. I mean, the first few months of this year really are all about rounding out the features and getting more projects up and running through our early access program for Truebit Verify. I think we're anticipating by mid-year being a good place to start opening up access more and more for public access, bringing on, as we talked about earlier, more node providers. So I think you'll see a lot of news and a lot of kind of exciting developments over the first half of this year, for sure.
Cool. Anything specific? Is it going to be really developer focused? Any kind of tooling? Any kind of, anything to make it easier?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. Our focus is on making it as easy as possible to develop through Truebit. So I think key things on the roadmap would be adding support for some additional languages, which really, again, WebAssembly supports in theory any language, but there's always testing and what I call fit and finish work to make sure that the tooling is there the right way you want as we add languages. And then really the security testing for anything that involves decentralized nodes is super, super important. So that's why we step through early access and kind of carefully open things up. So we'll be certainly seeing more of that as well.
And just to maybe ask it bluntly, it's probably something we covered earlier in a roundabout way. Is Truebit chain agnostic? I mean, you've talked about Ethereum a lot, but Solana's having its moment right now. Other chains are obviously going to come about.
Yeah, Truebit's chain agnostic. Remember, Truebit exists to help you run code off chain. So we're not forcing anybody into a particular chain. And we, also support a, kind of really robust ways of integrating with all the chains that you might be wanting to use. So yeah, I mean, we are just as excited as anyone about kind of the emergence of, ever faster, ever more scalable, ever more secure chains for sure.
Gotcha. Cool. So what's the best way for someone to get started with Truebit? The early access program you mentioned, docs, where should they go?
Absolutely. Super easy. Come to our website, truebit.io. Just click the button that says you're interested in early access. We can get in touch with you, give you more information, see if it's a good fit for now, and certainly have a good way to stay in touch as we keep moving forward.
All right, Blane, any last words? How can people find you? Anyone else you'd like them to follow? Where should they go?
Yeah, definitely follow Truebit on X, Twitter. That's our main engagement channel. I'm on LinkedIn. Look forward to having conversations like this in the future.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Excited for Truebit's future.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate it.
You got it.